My whole life, my father made me feel like a mistake, blaming me for my mother's death. And now, after losing everything and becoming homeless, I let him stay with me, hoping we could finally find common ground. But he took advantage of my kindness, lied to his wife about helping me buy my house, and tried to make me support him. My life had been hard from the very beginning. My mother died giving birth to me, and my father, the only parent I had, never let me forget it. He blamed me, a newborn, for her untimely death. Not a single day of my childhood passed without him reminding me, in his cold, bitter tone, that I was the reason she was gone. He would say my birth had taken from him the most precious person in his life, that he had never wanted me, and that my existence had come at too high a price. He made it clear that I owed him something, that I had to work to prove that my life was worth the loss of hers. Otherwise, her death would have been for nothing. Imagine hearing those words as a child. Imagine growing up with the belief that simply being alive was a mistake. I was too young to understand his grief, his loss, or his anger. But I needed a mother too, and she wasn't there. The only parent I had saw me as a burden, a curse. A father is supposed to be a protector, a teacher, a source of comfort. Mine was none of those things. Instead, he was a constant reminder that I was unwanted. Growing up in such an environment was crushing. I carried a deep, unshakable guilt for existing at all. There were moments when I wanted desperately to talk to him, to tell him how much his words hurt. But fear kept me silent. And when I did try, I was met with even more anger, more resentment. So, my childhood was one of loneliness and isolation. While other kids had parents who comforted them when they were sad, who gave them a sense of security, I felt like I was always walking on thin ice, terrified of triggering another outburst. Despite everything, I tried to understand his pain. I knew losing my mother had broken him, that he had never truly recovered. But that didn't make his words any lighter. I was just a kid trying to find my place in a world that felt cold and unwelcoming. And yet, deep down, I still longed for his approval. I remember the excitement I felt whenever I brought home a report card with good grades. Maybe this time I thought things would be different. I'd rush to him, eager to show my achievements, hoping for a smile, a word of praise, something, anything to make me feel like I mattered. But it was always the same. He'd barely glance at my grades, let out a dissatisfied grunt, and tell me to study harder. It was never enough. He reminded me that there were hundreds of other kids who could get the same marks, that there was nothing special about it. No matter how hard I tried, it was never enough for him. And it wasn't just about school. Anytime I wanted to do something outside of studying, play soccer, hang out with friends, join an event, he would shut it down immediately. The only thing that mattered, he said, was my education, so I could get out of his house as soon as possible. Those words cut deep. They reminded me that, to him, I was nothing more than an inconvenience. I saw how my friends' parents encouraged them, supported their hobbies, wanted them to enjoy their childhoods. I had none of that. My father made sure I knew I was just a guest in his house, one that could be kicked out at any moment if I didn't do what I was told. Weekends were no different from weekdays. If I asked to go outside, even just to the park, he would launch into a lecture about how much money he spent on me, how hard he worked to pay for my education. He made me feel like even the simplest joys, friendship, laughter, a moment of peace, were things I had no right to. Everything that made life feel normal, he saw as a waste of time. One of the most painful memories I have is of my 15th birthday. Most kids look forward to their birthdays, making plans with friends, expecting a day of celebration. For me, it was a day of dread. My father hated when I even acknowledged my birthday. But that year, I hoped things would be different. I just wanted to go to the movies with my friends, maybe eat some pizza. When I finally gathered the courage to ask him for a little money, he exploded. He yelled furious, saying I had no right to celebrate. Because my birthday, he reminded me, was also the day my mother died. He made it painfully clear that my birthday would always be the worst day of the year for him, and that I had no right to even think about enjoying it. So I never celebrated it, never had parties with friends. Over time, I stopped expecting anything else. These moments, repeated year after year, convinced me that my father truly hated me, that he didn't want me in his house at all. His constant rejection and criticism left deep scars on me. Eventually, I learned to keep my hopes and dreams to myself, to expect nothing from him because I knew that wanting his approval would only lead to disappointment and pain. I forced myself to be strong, to push through for my own sake. I focused on school, knowing that the sooner I could leave, the better. In the end, my hard work, persistence, and determination paid off. I still remember the day I received the acceptance letter from one of the top universities, with a full scholarship. It was a strange mix of relief and pride. I was finally leaving. I was walking away from my father's crushing presence and into a new chapter of my life, one where I could finally live on my own terms. Leaving that house felt like shedding a heavy weight I had been carrying my whole life. For the first time, I was truly free. Those 4 years in college became some of the best of my life. It was a time of growth, discovery, and happiness. I could finally live like a normal person. My father no longer controlled me, though he still tried to influence me from a distance. But I had stopped listening. I had lived under his shadow long enough. Now, it was time to make my own choices, to build the life I wanted for myself. Despite my newfound freedom, I never lost sight of my goals. I worked hard to maintain top grades, determined to make the most of the opportunity one had fought for. But I also found balance. I allowed myself to enjoy life, to go to parties, join clubs, make new friends, pursue hobbies. For the first time, I was truly living, and it was during this time that I met Sheila. Meeting her was one of the most unexpected and wonderful things to ever happen to me. From the very start, there was something about her that pulled me in. We were incredibly alike, both ambitious, determined, and career-focused. Sheila understood me in a way no one else ever had. One of the things I loved most about her was that we could sit together in complete silence for hours. She never pressured me to be someone I wasn't. She let me exist in my own space, in my own thoughts, something I had never experienced in any relationship before. With Sheila, I didn't have to carry the weight of my past alone. She saw through me, saw the pain I had lived with for so long, the pain that had become so normal to me that I had stopped questioning it. She was the first person to tell me, outright, how unfair it was for my father to blame me for my mother's death. She told me no child should have to bear that burden. She was the one who pushed me to seek therapy. I had never even considered it before. My father's words had sunk so deep into my mind that I had never thought I could free myself from them. Therapy changed my life. At first, it was difficult. Facing the reality of my childhood, acknowledging the trauma, and learning to undo the toxic beliefs I had carried was not easy. It took effort, so much effort, but therapy opened my eyes. It made me realize how deeply wrong my father had been, how undeserving I was of his cruelty. I finally understood. I wasn't to blame for my mother's death. I never had been, and my father's hatred was his burden to carry, not mine. As I started to heal, I began to feel something new, anger. It was as if all the years of buried frustration were finally bubbling to the surface. I had spent my entire life trying to earn his approval, trying to be the child he wanted, all while carrying the guilt he had forced onto me. But now I saw it for what it was: unfair, undeserved, and not my responsibility. That anger made it nearly impossible to maintain any kind of relationship with him. During college, I barely spoke to him, and when I did, our conversations were brief and tense. I found myself snapping at him, no longer able to tolerate his criticism or attempts to control me. I had spent too many years trapped under his expectations. Now I was finally breaking free. One day, I finally let it all out, the years of pain, the weight I had carried in silence. It wasn't planned. The words just poured out of me. I told him everything. How he had blamed me for my mother's death, how his words and actions had destroyed my mental health, and how I would no longer allow him to treat me like that. I made it clear that I was done being his scapegoat. I deserve respect, and if he couldn't give me that, I would cut him out of my life for good. For the first time, he had no response. He didn't apologize like I had once wished he would, but he also didn't deny what I said. After that conversation, I noticed a slight change in him. He seemed to be making an effort to be softer, less harsh when he spoke to me. It was as if he was trying, in his own way, to be different. But no matter how much he tried, our relationship remained strained. Years of pain and resentment don't just disappear overnight. I appreciated the small shift, but the damage he had done required much more than that to repair, if it was even possible to repair it all. As time passed, my anger towards him faded. I no longer carried the same level of guilt or rage that had once consumed me. I had come to accept that while I couldn't change the past, I had full control over how it shaped my future. Sheila played a huge role in that realization, and I would always be grateful to her for helping me see that I was worthy of love, respect, and happiness. Recently, my father remarried. He and his new wife, Day, had a small wedding, and despite everything that had happened between us, I decided to attend with Sheila. I was happy for him. A part of me even thought that maybe this marriage would change him for the better. But a month after the wedding, he called me desperate. He had made some bad financial decisions and was struggling to make ends meet. He confessed that he hadn't been able to pay rent for 6 months and was now on the verge of being evicted. He also admitted that he hadn't told Day about his situation because he feared it would cause problems in their marriage. And then, just like that, he asked me for money. The moment I heard it, I refused. It wasn't that I couldn't afford to help. I could, but I didn't want to become his safety net. Not after everything we had been through. I had worked too hard to build my own life, and I wasn't about to set a precedent where he could come to me every time he messed up. But after talking to Sheila, I reconsidered. He was still my father, and maybe, just maybe, he truly needed my help. So, I called him back and offered a compromise. I told him I wouldn't pay his rent, but I would let him and Day stay at my place temporarily. I had a house of my own, plenty of space, and I made it clear this was only until they saved enough money to move out. It was a tough decision, given our history, but it felt like the right one. I also made it very clear that this was a temporary arrangement, and I expected him to take action to get back on his feet. He hesitated, but eventually agreed. 2 weeks later, he and Day moved in. I had set up a guest room for them, and the first month was an adjustment period for all of us. Years had passed since we had last lived under the same roof, and now we were completely different people. But I was no longer the teenager who silently endured his criticism. I was an adult. I had my own life. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for his old habits to resurface. He started making comments about how I kept my house, about my routines, about my choices. It was as if nothing had changed. But this time, I wasn't going to let him have that power over me. Every time he tried to criticize or control aspects of my life, I pushed back. I made it clear that he had no right to dictate how I lived, especially while staying under my roof. I wasn't rude, but I was firm. I had spent too many years letting him control me, and I wasn't going back to that. Day, of course, wasn't happy about it. A few times, she told me I should show my father more respect, that he had supposedly sacrificed so much for me. I just shook my head. She didn't know the truth. She had no idea what he had put me through, but I saw no point in arguing with her about it. I had spent my entire childhood trying to please my father at the cost of my own happiness. I wasn't going to do that again. And if Day wanted to believe in some fantasy version of him, that was her problem, not mine. I knew that living together wouldn't be easy, but I had hoped that over time, we would find a way to coexist without unnecessary conflicts. But one evening, after an exhausting day at work, I came home to find my father sitting in the living room, watching TV with his wife. The house was a mess, and the kitchen sink was overflowing with dirty dishes. I took a deep breath and asked him why he hadn't cleaned up. After all, I had made it clear multiple times that they needed to contribute to household chores, and today was his turn to clean. And then, in that same condescending tone that always made my teeth clench, he said, "You're a grown man that I raised all by myself after your mother died. You should be ashamed to ask me to do anything. You can wash the damn dishes yourself." Something inside me snapped. I shot back. You know what's actually shameful? That you're sitting on my couch in my house, watching my TV, eating my food, and still think you have the right to boss me around when you were the one begging me to let you stay here for free. You and your wife haven't lifted a damn finger to help around here. So if you don't feel like doing your part, you can pack your things and leave. Right now. My father just stared at me, completely caught off guard. The room fell into a thick, uncomfortable silence. And for a moment, I actually thought he might stand up and walk out, but I knew he had nowhere else to go. So I turned and walked away, slamming the kitchen door behind me, my heart pounding with anger and frustration. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen to find only Day sitting there. My father had probably left early for work. I was about to grab my coffee and leave when she asked to talk. I had no idea what to expect, but I sat down and listened. With a serious expression, she told me how deeply hurt my father was by our argument the night before. She said I had no right to speak to him that way, especially after everything he had supposedly done for me, including helping me buy my house. I blinked, confused. What do you mean, helping me buy my house? She went on to explain that my father had told her he used his savings to help me afford my home. I nearly laughed out loud. The money I used to buy this house? I had saved for years, working my ass off to make it happen. My father had contributed absolutely nothing, still trying to hold back my amusement. I asked her again if she was sure about what he had told her. She insisted that given his financial struggles, it would only be fair if I started paying him back by covering their rent, since in her mind, this was his house too. She called it a small token of gratitude for the financial sacrifices he had supposedly made for me. That was it. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I burst into laughter. Real, uncontrollable laughter. The situation was so absurd, so ridiculous, that I simply couldn't take it seriously. When I finally managed to stop laughing, I looked her dead in the eyes and told her the truth. I was the sole owner of the house. My father had never given me a single penny. The look on her face was priceless. It was clear that she had no idea. She sat there, caught between embarrassment and growing anger, as reality sank in. Finally, she asked me outright if my father had ever helped me financially. I told her the truth. He couldn't even afford his own rent. So how the hell could he have helped me buy a house? She didn't argue after that. She didn't say another word. Instead, later that same day, she packed her things and left. I didn't stop her. It wasn't my business to interfere. That evening, when my father came home and saw her things gone, he immediately called her. I heard him in the other room, his voice growing increasingly panicked. When he finally got off the phone, he stormed into my room, furious. "You just couldn't keep your damn mouth shut, could you?" he snapped. I stared at him, unbothered. "You made her feel uncomfortable on purpose," he accused. "You sabotaged my marriage by telling her things she didn't need to know. I don't understand why you couldn't just let her believe what she wanted." I let out a sharp breath, trying to stay calm. "You mean the truth? You wanted me to let her believe your lies? How is that my fault?" He crossed his arms, his frustration boiling over. "Now she sees me as useless compared to you, like I'm some kind of failure. And that was when I truly lost my patience." I shook my head and said, "You feel like a failure because you lied, not because of me. You asked for my help, I gave it to you. And instead of being grateful, you tried to manipulate the situation to make yourself look better. That's not on me, that's on you." But as always, he refused to see the truth. For years, he had treated me like I was a burden, a mistake, the source of all his problems. And even now, after everything, he still wanted to make me the villain in his story. But this time, I wasn't playing along. He insisted that I should call Day and apologize, that I needed to fix the situation. What he really wanted was for me to lie, to let her keep believing that he had somehow helped me buy my house. I refused. I was exhausted from his constant manipulation, the endless cycle of guilt and blame. I had reached my limit. Finally, I told him I couldn't do it anymore. His presence in my home, the constant tension and fights, were starting to take a serious toll on my mental health. I told him he needed to pack his things and leave the next day. It wasn't an easy decision. Despite everything, it still hurt. But I needed to set boundaries to protect my own peace, my sanity. He protested, saying he had nowhere to go, pleading for more time. But at that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. I was done listening to his excuses. I stood my ground and insisted he leave in the morning. Since then, my father has continued to call me, complaining that I ruined his life and his marriage because Day refuses to talk to him. He blames me for what happened with her, telling me that a good son would never kick out his own father. Update 1. I appreciate everyone reminding me just how much my father put me through over the years. Many people suggested that I reach out today and tell her the truth about my childhood, since she likely had no idea what kind of person he really was. Up until now, I had avoided getting involved in his affairs. But I realized that she deserved to know the truth, especially if he had lied to her about other things as well. So, I decided to reach out to her. Update 2. A week later, I finally had the chance to talk today. It turned out that she had no idea what my childhood had been like. I told her everything: the guilt, the emotional abuse, the way my father made me feel like a burden from the moment I was born. I explained how much it had affected me and how hard I had worked to rebuild my life. She was shocked. She admitted that my father had painted a completely different picture of himself, portraying himself as a selfless single parent who had sacrificed everything for his child. I shared stories from my childhood, how he had blamed me for my mother's death, how he had torn me down at every opportunity. She listened, and for the first time, I felt like someone who had believed his lies finally understood my side of things. Then, she admitted something that I hadn't known before. She told me that my father had actually lost all his money due to gambling. She hadn't mentioned it before because he had been too ashamed to admit it, but that was the real reason for his financial problems. And when he first suggested moving in with me, she had actually been against it. She didn't want to live with me. Apparently, that's why he lied to her. He told her that he had helped me buy my house, making it seem like he had some kind of claim to my home. That way, when he convinced her to move in, it wouldn't feel like they were imposing. But when she found out that his story was completely false, that he had manipulated her into going along with his plan, she was devastated. She admitted that she felt embarrassed about the way she had treated me, especially when she had suggested that I start paying him rent. I told her it wasn't her fault. The blame was entirely on him. Before we ended our conversation, she told me that she needed to take a break from her relationship with my father to process everything. Update 3. Hey everyone, I know I haven't posted anything in a while, 3 months to be exact. Since asking my father to leave, I have completely cut him out of my life. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was necessary for my mental and emotional well-being. The last time we spoke, he once again tried to blame me for everything. But this time, I didn't let him get to me. I ended the call and blocked him immediately. And honestly, I feel so much better. For the first time in my life, I have my space, my peace. Sheila has been an incredible source of support throughout all of this. She has been there for me, comforting me, encouraging me, helping me process all the emotions that came with cutting ties with my father. Her support has meant everything to me. Now, I'm focused on building the life I've always wanted, chasing my goals, and, most importantly, finally allowing myself to be happy. And it feels damn good.